Imagine this, an empire so vast that it stretched across 3 continents, ruling over lands from the sun-drenched shores of North Africa to the cold, war-torn expanses of Eastern Europe. It controlled vital trade routes, forged global connections, and wielded power that shapes the course of history for over 600 years. Sounds like something out of a historical epic, right? But this was the Ottoman Empire, the kind of empire that, if it were around today, would have more than just a Wikipedia page. It'd have an entire Netflix series. So how did a small tribe of Turkish warriors from Anatolia manage to build such a powerhouse that, at its height, spanned the Balkans, the Middle East, and large parts of North Africa? What happened to the once mighty empire that ultimately crumbled into the ashes of history, leaving behind a modern-day Turkey with echoes of its past? Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore today, folks. In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into the entire history of the Ottoman Empire. Yes, the entire history, because you didn't think I'd give you just a quick 10-minute overview, did you? We're going all the way from the humble beginnings in the 13th century to the dramatic collapse in the early 20th century. So buckle up, because this is going to be a historical roller coaster. We'll uncover the origins of the Ottomans, their golden age under Suleiman the Magnificent. Spoiler alert, it's not just the mustache that made him great. Their rise to power, their slow but steady decline, and finally, their dramatic fall in the aftermath of World War I. Along the way, you'll meet the sultans, the armies, and the battles that made the Ottoman Empire one of the most fascinating chapters in world history. By the end of this video, you'll know why the Ottomans were so influential and how their empire's story continues to shape the world today. Ready to explore the rise and fall of one of the most iconic empires in history? Let's get started. Picture this. It's the early 1300s, and the Mongol invasion has left the Middle East in chaos. The Byzantine Empire, once a mighty force, is on its last legs. Enter Osman I, a leader from a small tribe in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, who saw an opportunity amidst the ruins of the old world. Now, Osman wasn't exactly the kind of guy to make a splash on the global stage at first. No dramatic speeches or world-shaking policies. But sometimes, it's the quiet, determined ones that change the world. Osman I and his followers were originally part of the Seljuk Turks, who had settled in Anatolia after the Mongols swept through Central Asia. As the Seljuks lost power, Osman decided it was time for his tribe to carve out its own destiny. With a couple of horses, a few hundred men, and an ambitious spirit, Osman launched what would become the Ottoman Empire. In the early years, the Ottomans were essentially raiders and warriors, fighting for territory, like most other tribes of the time. But what set them apart was their incredible ability to adapt, expand, and unite the lands around them. A powerful scene depicting Ottoman warriors on horseback, crossing diverse landscapes, ranging from mountains to fertile plains. The warriors are shown in different stages of adaptation, some negotiating with local leaders, others engaging in strategic battle, and a few uniting various groups. The environment is vibrant, with a clear visual progression from conflict to unity. The sky is bright, symbolizing growth and expansion, highlighting the Ottomans' ability to adapt and bring together the lands around them. Fast forward to the mid-15th century, and we're witnessing one of the most dramatic moments in history. The Byzantine Empire, that ancient powerhouse, is a shadow of its former self. The city of Constantinople, the last remaining jewel of the Byzantine Empire, is sitting there, ripe for the picking. Enter Sultan Mehmed II, also known as Mehmed the Conqueror. This guy wasn't just any ruler. He was a military genius with the ambition to match. At just 21 years old, he laid siege to the city in 1453, and after a grueling 53-day siege, Constantinople finally fell. Now, you might be thinking, yeah, some guy took over a city, big deal. But hold on, this wasn't just any city. Constantinople was the city. It had been the capital of the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years, and its fall marked the end of an era. For the Ottomans, it was a game changer. Mehmed didn't just conquer the city, he transformed it into Istanbul, the new capital of his empire. And with that, the Ottomans had established themselves as one of the major powers in the world. Oh, and by the way, he didn't do this with a regular army. He used some of the largest cannons ever created at the time, which were capable of smashing through the massive walls of Constantinople. Think of it as medieval artillery's first appearance on the world stage. And it worked. A lot of people were very, very impressed by Mehmed's military savvy. Now that Istanbul was the jewel of the empire, the Ottomans were poised to take full advantage of their strategic location. Nestled between Europe and Asia, Istanbul became a bridge for trade, culture, and conquest. It was the perfect spot to control both land and sea trade routes. And the Ottomans did not waste this opportunity. From here, they set their sights on expanding even further. The Ottomans didn't just conquer lands for the sake of conquest. Oh no, they were smart. They knew that controlling key trade routes meant wealth and power. The empire expanded westward into the Balkans, northward into Russia, and southward into North Africa, securing valuable territories along the way. By the time Mehmed II's successor, Selim I, took the throne, the Ottomans had established a foothold in the holy cities of Islam, like Mecca and Medina, which gave them immense religious prestige. This was a big deal because in the Islamic world, being the custodian of these holy cities meant they had a claim to spiritual leadership as well as political power. Selim I's victory in 1516 at the Battle of Majd against the Mamluks was pivotal. This victory secured the Ottomans' control over Egypt, and with it, the strategic routes to the Red Sea and the Arabian Peninsula. The Ottomans weren't just an empire. They were now a powerful, multifaceted powerhouse with military, economic, and spiritual influence. Now let's talk about the man who truly brought the Ottoman Empire to its magnificent peak. Suleiman I, also known as Suleiman the Magnificent. I know, right? With a title like that, he must have been pretty extraordinary. And trust me, he was. Suleiman's reign from 1520 to 1566 is often regarded as the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. He was like the rock star sultan, except instead of guitars, he wielded military strategy. And instead of concerts, he led campaigns across Europe, Asia, and Africa. But this wasn't all about brute force. Suleiman understood that to truly leave a mark, he had to combine power with culture, diplomacy, and a legal system that would hold the empire together. He launched successful military campaigns that expanded the empire's reach even further. From the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, which crushed the Kingdom of Hungary, to naval victories in the Mediterranean, Suleiman seemed unstoppable. He even laid siege to Vienna, one of Europe's most fortified cities. The Ottomans were at the doorstep of Western Europe, and it looked like they were about to kick the door down. But it wasn't all war. Suleiman had a vision beyond military conquest. He oversaw a major overhaul of Ottoman law, establishing the Kanun, a code of laws that complemented Islamic law, Sharia. This was a revolutionary move, creating a legal system that helped maintain order across the vast empire, which was no small feat considering how diverse the Ottoman population was. Oh, and did I mention that Suleiman wasn't just a fearsome military leader and lawmaker? He was also a bit of a poet and an art lover. He was known for writing beautiful poetry in Persian and for supporting the flourishing of the arts in his empire. If there had been an Ottoman Empire Hall of Fame, Suleiman's portrait would be right at the top, along with maybe a marble bust, a few trophies, and some fine Persian carpets. So what does an empire do when it has conquered lands from Europe to the Middle East? It starts making serious money. The Ottoman Empire, under Suleiman, controlled key trade routes that connected Europe, Asia, and Africa. This meant they had a monopoly on the movement of goods between the continents. The Silk Road? Yep, the Ottomans controlled large parts of it. The empire became a central hub for trade. From spices and silk to gold and cotton, the Ottomans controlled some of the world's most valuable commodities. And let's not forget about coffee. The Ottomans didn't invent coffee, but they certainly made it famous. The first coffee house in Europe opened in Istanbul in the 16th century. And, well, let's just say the world hasn't looked back since. The naval fleet, which was once a formidable force in the Mediterranean, helped safeguard the empire's control over these routes. The Ottomans weren't just sitting pretty in their palaces. They were making deals, striking trade agreements, and controlling the flow of goods in and out of their empire like an ancient-day Amazon. While Suleiman was busy expanding the empire, he also made sure to foster an environment where culture and religion could thrive. Under his reign, the Ottomans were seen as the guardians of Islam. With the conquest of Mecca and Medina, the Ottomans cemented their position as the most powerful Islamic empire. But it wasn't just about religion. It was about blending cultures. The empire was a melting pot. Suleiman's court was home to people from different backgrounds, including Arabs, Persians, Slavs, Armenians, and Jews. The Ottomans embraced this diversity by creating the millet system, which allowed non-Muslim communities to govern themselves in matters of religion and law. The system helped to reduce friction between different ethnic and religious groups and contributed to the empire's stability. And then there was the art. The Ottomans were heavily influenced by Persian, Byzantine, and Arab art, which led to a unique fusion of styles. The famous Suleimani Mosque in Istanbul is a prime example of Ottoman architecture. The intricate tile work, massive dome, and grand courtyard are the kind of features that make you look up, take a deep breath, and say, wow, they really knew how to build a building. In literature, Suleiman's reign saw a blossoming of poetry, especially in Persian and Turkish, as well as a rise in calligraphy and the decorative arts. The Ottomans knew how to live the good life, not just with wealth and power, but also with the appreciation of beauty in all its forms. Now, remember how I mentioned that Suleiman led military campaigns that stretched the empire's borders? Let's take a moment to focus on his military prowess. By the time he was done, the Ottoman Empire had expanded from its heartland in Anatolia to a vast swath of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Suleiman's military strategies were groundbreaking, and his naval fleet was one of the most powerful in the world. Under his command, the Ottomans had the strongest navy in the Mediterranean. They could sail to Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and Europe with relative ease. In fact, they controlled most of the Mediterranean and even made their mark on the Red Sea. In one of his most notable naval victories, Suleiman's fleet defeated the combined forces of the Holy Roman Empire and Venice at the Battle of Preveza in 1538. This solidified Ottoman naval dominance for decades, giving them control over crucial maritime routes and making their empire a formidable force in world trade and warfare. But it wasn't all sunshine and cannonballs. The Ottomans were facing increasing challenges from the rising powers of Europe. The Habsburgs, the Russians, and the Safavids in Persia were all flexing their muscles, which meant that Suleiman's empire had to remain on its toes. But while he was alive, the Ottomans were truly at the top of their game. By the late 16th century, the Ottoman Empire, once an unstoppable juggernaut, started to show signs of strain. It wasn't that the empire had suddenly lost its grandeur overnight. It was more like that feeling you get when you're trying to carry too many bags at once, and you start to feel the weight. The Ottomans were simply starting to show the cracks in their foundation. First off, the internal struggles were becoming more apparent. The once fierce military, which had helped the Ottomans conquer vast swaths of land, started losing its edge. A tense and somber scene inside an Ottoman military barracks, where soldiers, once proud and fierce, now sit with weary expressions, their armor rusting and weapons dulled. In the foreground, an Ottoman general looks on with concern, his hand resting on a weathered map that shows the empire's territories slipping away. Soldiers in the background appear distracted, their focus waning, reflecting the internal struggles and loss of military prowess. The barracks are dimly lit, with shadows casting over the once gleaming swords and shields, symbolizing the weakening of the Ottoman military machine. They had gone from being an elite fighting force to a group of pampered, corrupt soldiers with little discipline. They weren't the sharp, disciplined warriors they used to be, and this became a serious problem as external threats began to increase. On top of that, the central authority began to weaken. Sultans became less powerful, often surrounded by intrigue, factionalism, and corruption. By the late 17th century, the sultans weren't ruling with the same strong hand that had defined the empire's early years. And as a result, local provincial rulers gained more autonomy, making the empire feel more like a loosely connected federation rather than a unified empire. Now, let's fast forward a bit to the 18th century. This was a time when the Ottoman Empire began to really feel the pressure from rising European powers. While the Ottomans were busy trying to hold on to their territory, Europe was undergoing its age of enlightenment and industrial revolution. The Ottomans, however, were stuck in a sort of time warp, unable to keep up with the technological and intellectual advances of the West. The empire began to lose significant territories. The Habsburgs, modern-day Austria, the Russian Empire, and the Persians all started nibbling away at Ottoman land. The Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca in 1774, which marked the end of the Russo-Turkish War, was a massive blow. Russia gained control of strategic territories in the Black Sea, and the Ottomans had to make significant concessions. Not only that, but Russia also began to present itself as the protector of the Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire, which further eroded the Ottomans' control over their subjects. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was on the verge of collapse. Its territorial losses continued, and nationalism began to take hold in its various provinces. Greece, Serbia, and other regions in the Balkans began to demand independence, and Europe, now more advanced both militarily and economically, was more than happy to support these movements. The Greek War of Independence, 1821 to 1830, was one of the first major cracks in the Ottoman Empire's structure. The Greeks, with the support of European powers like Britain, France, and Russia, successfully fought for and gained their independence from the Ottomans. And that was just the beginning. Soon, other parts of the empire would follow suit. In response to these external and internal pressures, the Ottomans attempted to modernize and reform in the 19th century, but it was like trying to patch up a sinking ship. The Tanzimat reforms, 1839 to 1876, were a series of attempts to modernize the military, economy, and legal system in an effort to save the empire from falling apart. They introduced new legal codes, schools, and a more centralized government structure. The Ottomans tried to adopt European-style institutions and modernize their army, but the reforms were often poorly implemented and met with resistance from traditionalists within the empire. The Tanzimat reforms, while well-intentioned, didn't have the desired effect. The central government was still weak, and the empire's vast diversity, ethnically, religiously, and culturally, made it increasingly difficult to maintain control. It's kind of like trying to herd a group of cats, each with its own agenda, while juggling flaming swords. Meanwhile, nationalism, a new force sweeping across Europe, began to spread to the Ottoman subjects. Various ethnic groups within the empire, Armenians, Arabs, Greeks, Serbs, and others, started to push for their own independence. This led to a rise in separatist movements and rebellions. Nationalism was like a wildfire, and the Ottoman Empire, struggling to hold it all together, was the dry brush. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, was another example of how the empire was struggling to keep its footing. The Ottomans, allied with Britain and France, fought against Russia in a war over control of the Black Sea and the rights of Christian minorities within the empire. While the Ottomans technically won, the war exposed the empire's military and economic weaknesses. It was clear that the empire was not the powerhouse it once was. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman military was no longer the unstoppable force it had once been. In fact, it was no longer even a competitive one. The Ottomans had been relying on traditional military strategies and outdated tactics, while the rest of the world was embracing modern warfare, including industrialization and weaponry. The once dominant Ottoman navy was now a shadow of its former self, and the empire's military infrastructure was woefully outdated. Economically, the empire was facing severe problems. The Ottomans were falling further and further behind the industrialized powers of Europe. Their economy was heavily reliant on agriculture, but their ability to control trade and generate wealth from it had dwindled. Meanwhile, European powers had begun to carve out spheres of influence within Ottoman territory, undermining the empire's economic independence. The Ottoman Empire, by the early 20th century, had become what some historians like to call the sick man of Europe. It was severely weakened, losing territories left and right, and facing constant internal struggles. But what really sped up the final countdown to the empire's demise was World War I. When the war broke out in 1914, the Ottomans made a crucial and ultimately disastrous decision. They sided with the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. At the time, the empire was hoping for a revival of its military glory. But as we know from history, it didn't quite work out that way. The Ottomans' decision to join the war was more about survival than conquest. They were hoping that the Central Powers could help them regain lost territory and restore their power. Spoiler alert, it didn't go as planned. The Ottomans' involvement in the war was marked by a series of military defeats. The empire faced fronts on multiple sides: the British and French forces on the Gallipoli Peninsula, Russian forces in the Caucasus, and Arab nationalist uprisings in the Middle East. The Ottoman military, already in decline, struggled to keep up with the modern warfare techniques of their enemies. One of the most significant failures came in 1915 with the Gallipoli campaign. The Ottomans, under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, managed to defeat the Allied forces, but this victory was short-lived in the grand scheme of the war. By 1918, the Ottomans were on the losing side, and the empire was on the brink of collapse. The war's end, and the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, which partitioned the Ottoman Empire and handed large parts of its territory to European powers, marked the final blow. The empire that once spanned 3 continents was being dismantled piece by piece. With the Ottoman Empire crumbling, the Turkish War of Independence began in 1919, led by a man who would soon become the most famous figure in modern Turkish history, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Ataturk, a former military officer, was not content to watch his homeland fall under foreign control. After the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire was occupied by Allied forces, and Greece, Armenia, and France were carving out parts of Turkish territory for themselves. But Ataturk had a different vision. He wanted to see a sovereign, independent Turkey, free from foreign occupation. In 1919, Ataturk rallied support and formed a nationalist movement that took on the occupying forces head first. The conflict that ensued became known as the Turkish War of Independence. It wasn't just a military fight. It was a political and ideological battle for the soul of the Turkish people. Ataturk and his supporters envisioned a modern, secular, and independent Turkish republic, and they weren't afraid to fight for it. Ataturk's forces, known as the Grand National Assembly, won a series of key victories over the Greek, Armenian, and French forces. With the help of the Soviet Union, they managed to push the foreign occupiers out of Turkey and regain control of their land. But the road to independence wasn't easy. The war was brutal, and the stakes were high. Ataturk's leadership was essential in uniting the various factions in Turkey, and his military genius helped secure victory. The victory culminated in the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which recognized the sovereignty of the new Turkish state. As the Turkish War of Independence came to a close, the Ottoman Sultanate, which had been in power for over 600 years, was no longer viable. In 1922, Ataturk and his nationalist government abolished the Sultanate, officially ending the reign of the Ottoman sultans. The last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, was deposed, and he fled into exile. The age of the Ottoman Empire had come to an end, and the door to a new chapter in Turkish history had been opened. Ataturk didn't stop there. He had a grand vision for the future of Turkey, and the Ottoman legacy had no place in that vision. The monarchy was gone, and in its place, a republic was born. Ataturk's reforms, including the adoption of a new Latin alphabet, secularization, and the introduction of modern legal and educational systems, transformed Turkey into a nation-state that was far removed from the Ottoman Empire. The fall of the Ottoman Empire wasn't just the end of a dynasty. It was the beginning of a new era for the Turkish people. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's reforms, which began after the war and continued through the 1920s and 1930s, completely reshaped Turkey into a modern republic. Ataturk's vision of a secular, democratic, and westernized country stood in stark contrast to the theocratic, imperial, and often chaotic Ottoman past. Ataturk also sought to modernize Turkey's economy, military, and education system. His policies focused on industrialization, modernizing agriculture, and increasing literacy rates. The adoption of secularism and the separation of religion from the state was a bold move that transformed Turkey's social and political landscape. Ataturk's leadership turned Turkey into a country that was no longer defined by its Ottoman past, but rather by its new identity as a progressive, independent nation. The legacy of the Ottoman Empire, however, continued to resonate in Turkey and beyond. The empire's cultural influence, from art and architecture to cuisine and language, continues to shape the region today. And while the Ottoman Empire may have faded into history, its impact on the Middle East, the Balkans, and even Europe remains undeniable. Now live from the new course of history for centuries, from its humble beginnings in Anatolia to its peak as a dominant force in Europe, Asia, and Africa, the Ottomans were not just conquerors. They were cultural pioneers, legal reformers, and economic powerhouses. They bridged the gap between East and the Game's laters. And the Ottoman Empire was more than just an empire. It was a civilization that influenced the West, and their empire was a melting pot of languages, religions, and traditions. But like all great empires, the Ottomans were not immune to the forces of time. Their long reign came to an end, not with a single battle or one decisive moment, but through a combination of internal strife, external pressures, and the rise of modernity. The decline of the Ottoman Empire was gradual, and its fall was inevitable. But that doesn't mean it didn't leave behind an indelible mark on the world. Even after its collapse, the legacy of the Ottomans lives on today. The modern nation of Turkey, under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, transformed the old Ottoman heartland into a republic that embraced secularism, democracy, and modernization. But let's not forget, Turkey's journey is one deeply intertwined with the Ottoman Empire. From the streets of Istanbul to the shores of the Bosphorus, you can still see the fingerprints of the Ottomans in every corner of Turkish life, in their architecture, cuisine, and cultural practices. In the Middle East, the Balkans, and North Africa, the Ottoman influence persists in countless ways. From the Islamic world's connection to the Caliphate, to the modern political and social structures that were shaped by Ottoman governance. Though the empire may be gone, its influence on geopolitics and cultural identity remains as potent as ever. So what's the takeaway from all this? The Ottoman Empire's rise. Today, the Ottomans are a distant memory, but their story still resonates in the political and cultural landscapes of the countries that once formed part of their empire. So the next time you sip on a cup of Turkish coffee, wander through the streets of Istanbul, or even look at the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East, remember, the legacy of the Ottomans is still very much alive. If you've enjoyed this journey through the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss another historical deep dive. And hey, share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of the Ottoman Empire's history do you find most fascinating? Was it the conquest of Constantinople, Suleiman the Magnificent's reign, or maybe the collapse of the empire after World War I? Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and remember, history is never as simple as it seems.